All right. So, what I want to cover today is Mexican American education in the Southwest, and this actually picks up a reading that we began that we worked on 4 weeks ago, and takes us a little bit further into the contemporary era. And just like with the reading 4 weeks ago, we're going to cover some of the same key areas: school access, quality of education, curriculum policies, and patterns of school performance. Those are subtitles from the actual reading, and we're just going to cover some key points related to each of those areas. And then some additional concepts with this reading that we want to talk about are deficit thinking. We'll talk about vocational education, the IQ, the impact and criticisms of IQ testing. And then we'll talk about segregation, the court cases that revolved around it. So with this week, just like with last week, there are two dimensions. There's one where we're talking about the impact that Hispanic, Latina, Latino students faced through the 20th century, the struggles they dealt with in the school and education system, but then also how parents and students reacted, how they challenged these things, and so the authors call this kind of the plight dimension, the struggle dimension, and we're going to look at both of those throughout this reading. So, deficit thinking, I want to explain, and this was a very influential and popular concept in education through the 1980s, 90s, and into the 2000s, until I think there was a backlash and a criticism of it. And that is the kind of thinking that connects, that blames basically poor school performance on individuals. It's often like considered genetically based, although sometimes there are elements of this where it's kind of blamed on broader cultural influences. Um, but again, deficit thinking, looking at the child as having some sort of deficit that is solely responsible for their performance or poor performance in school, and often applied more broadly to groups of students. And and basically, there are three main components that I want you to know of that are that are criticized and pointed out in the reading, and that is that deficit thinking views the individual devoid of context, meaning does not look at other factors like like poverty, language deficits, or language learning, other factors that might be influencing school performance, and especially does not look at the school as responsible generally for student learning. So it's the individual devoid of context. Blames the victim. So what they talk about is that often the students who are the victims of underfunded or overcrowded schools are then blamed for their poor performance. And then the prescript has a prescriptive component. So those are the three factors. The prescriptive component means that deficit thinking often is responsible for things like tracking into low-level vocational programs, and we'll talk about this, but overrepresentations, for example, in special education, those types of things. So that's the impact of deficit thinking, and those are things I want you to be familiar with. The culture of poverty is kind of an outgrowth of deficit thinking that, again, dominated a lot of educational literature through the 90s and into the 2000s. So I show this picture sometime of the show The Wire, which was in the early 2000s, filmed in Baltimore. And one of the seasons focused on the kids kind of in the early part. And the culture of poverty is often that kids in poverty have a subculture that prevents them from being successful in school. But as the season panned out and looked more broadly at the students, you see that the school system itself often prevents students from being successful in that context. Um, And so, yeah, the idea is that the poor create their own problems, they are deprived, and have limited educatability. The Wire, by the way, as a side note, there were classes, sociology classes at Harvard, Duke, a number of other universities built around The Wire. Um, so it's a very compelling show, but I think it did a really good job of looking at different domains within Baltimore City that impacted, the lives of people who were in poverty. And one of those was the education system. So inferior schooling was a major focus of the early part of the chapter, and this is generally something that in class I have students discuss together from the reading. But there's a very, to me, very vivid description of the school system that was available for Hispanic students. And you got to remember, we're talking about segregated schooling, and segregated schools for Hispanic students were characterized by really disproportionate student to teacher ratios. Classrooms were often 30, 40 students per teacher. And if you've taught in schools, you know that this makes a very a, a big difference in the quality of education. Funding disparities that were significant per student. And then they describe the school. They talk about it being, often wood, poorly ventilated, a lack of services for Hispanic students compared to Anglo students. Anglo students often had, just things like band, nicer cafeterias, um, adequate restrooms, where those were denied to Hispanic students. Those schools lacked those facilities. Even medical, dental, other wraparound services that Anglo schools had in the Southwest, um, Hispanic students did not have those. And since we are talking about segregated schools, that does lead to a struggle, to parents reacting against school segregation. And especially, this really gained momentum after the World Wars, in which, many Hispanics went off and fought on behalf of the United States and then came back to find their kids being denied adequate educational opportunity. And so there's a major concerted effort among parents to challenge school segregation in the court system, and a number of different cases are explored in the reading. The Salvatierra case is one, for example, and there were often debates and discussions. What this revolved around was the definitions themselves of things like white versus colored. What students fit kind of in those classifications, and those were challenged in court. The Mendez case, which is v. Westminster, which is mentioned later, revolved around the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause. But the one that I want you to remember, and the case that's often thought of as our nation's first successful desegregation case, was Alvarez v. Lemon Grove. And so that's going to be important for you to remember and to be familiar with. Alvarez v. Lemon Grove. And this case revolved around a group of students in California in the Lemon Grove School District who are segregated. The school district, as the population's growing, proposed a new segregated school. The parents challenged it. It went to the judge, and the judge ruled against segregation. He said it prevents language development. It holds students back in terms of their education. And so the parents won the case, and it was considered our country's first successful desegregation case. Now, it's also important to know that it was isolated, it was local, it had no precedent-setting effect. It didn't change segregated schooling throughout the United States for Hispanic students at that time, but this was influential. I think, you know, African Americans, which we're going to talk about the African American school desegregation efforts in the coming weeks, but the NAACP and other civil rights organizations are watching what's happening around the country with school desegregation cases and follow this case. And it does become, I think, a bit of a model for how to challenge school segregation nationally. So one of the things that happens during this time period are is that Hispanic students are subjected to IQ testing, which is something we talked about a week ago in class. And so we covered kind of IQ testing more broadly throughout the 20th century. Here, what we see is the impact on a specific group of students. And so Mexican American students in the Southwest were given IQ tests in English, often denied. Well, they were denied, if they did have, if English was not their first language, that was not taken into consideration. They were not given bilingual versions of the test or the test in their native language. And even as students could speak English fluently, I mean, one thing to know that we talked about is that IQ testing is often very time oriented. It's logically, linguistically based. And so even if English was, if students were fluent in English, if it was their second language, those slight delays in timing would have had a big impact on their overall score. And so this leads to 50% of the Mexican American school age population being labeled as mentally sub-average. Another, I think, jarring statistic that's given in the reading is that Hispanic students are overrepresented for a period of time by 285% in special education. And if you remember our discussion of the bell curve and the distribution, the way that IQ should be distributed, you would not, you would see kind of a group divided among the upper and lower parts of that distribution. So 50% is a huge, huge overrepresentation of one group when labeled as mentally sub-average. And so this leads to challenges to that idea, cultural critiques, and one of the most famous is by Jorge Isidore Sanchez, who is a professor at UT Austin. Today, the education building at the University of Texas Austin is named after him. But he wrote a lot on this topic and really challenged this idea and showed definitively that it was the lack of educational opportunity, it was the poor conditions in which students found themselves that led to their scores on those IQ tests, as well as linguistic differences not being provided the test in their native language. One of the kind of more contemporary topics and issues that I've talked about, and I will share a video of this on Canvas, but in the reading, the assault on against Mexican American curriculum is mentioned in the reading, and one example I've used from the contemporary time period is the Arizona Ethnic Studies ban, which also led to banned books from Arizona. And I want to say it's around 2007, Arizona banned Mexican American studies in their Tucson school district, and it spread throughout the bans kind of spread in that area. Tucson's very segregated with a lot of Hispanics in the sort of working class Hispanics in the southern part of the school district, and northern upper middle class Anglos in the northern part of the city. And so I think the teachers started this program really hoping to connect with Hispanic youth in the school system who had an overrepresentation in terms of dropout rates and low test scores, things like that. The program was having a positive impact. I think one of the problems to me was that while the school district and superintendent, may have had some valid concerns, the school board did not work with the teachers in the Tucson school district, and it was, I think it created an adversarial kind of us versus them dynamic. And more recently, a judge did overturn the ban, and I don't think that that ethnic studies program has been reintroduced. But one of the positive impacts of this was that it did lead to ethnic studies programs around the country, and Indiana was one of those states where our governor did implement a ethnic studies requirement for high schools. So that's fairly recent, but if you have taken ethnic studies in high school, it's probably a result of that legislation and that change. I think a lot of governors sort of reacted to this, and the press around it, and and so ethnic studies is something that I generally have students discuss in class, but I think it's worth considering. So it's something I want you to be familiar with: Arizona's ethnic studies ban. All right. So in this next part, I just want to point out, to introduce this, that the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights did commission a large study to look at what was going on in the Southwest in terms of Hispanic students. And that report came back in a number of different areas that are detailed in our reading for this week. And I'm just going to capture some key points with each of these. And I would encourage you to go through and take your own notes from the reading and look at each one of these core sections. So in terms of school segregation, we've already talked about that school segregation did remain in place for Hispanic students throughout much of the 20th century. One of the takeaway key points that I want you to know is that even from this baseline data, from the Mays data in the 1960s, which was post Brown v. Board, school segregation did rise. So it did continue to increase. And just to point out, today, Hispanics are one of the most segregated groups in our public education system, which is a topic we will actually come back to in a couple weeks, and we'll talk about a little more in depth. In terms of academic performance, we continued to see throughout the 20th century gaps between Anglo students and Hispanic students in terms of all the key areas: math, language arts, and science. So in the core sort of areas that are tested, and they give examples of the Texas assessment, academic assessment, the gap that existed between Anglo students and Hispanic students, in all of the key areas. And one of the points that I want to come back to mention is that last time, 4 weeks ago, when we had the prior part of this reading, we talked about how some states had a more additive approach, others had a more subtractive approach. Those states that had a more additive approach have had better academic performance. So for example, New Mexico, and traditionally this was Arizona, that had a better relationship and a more additive approach. More recently, what I would tend to say is that I think in many ways Arizona has become a more subtractive state. Texas has been reversing and has been doing some really good things, and I think have seen some improvement among Hispanic students. But for this time period, when we're looking at it, both Texas and California are the two states that had a traditionally subtractive approach and had more broad, wide gaps in academic performance. In terms of high school retention, again, major disparities between Anglo and Hispanic students. And I want to mention this is still an ongoing issue today. So the Mays report pointed out that Anglo students had a completion rate of about 86%, while for Hispanic students, again, in those more subtractive states, it was often around 60%. Texas at times as low as 50%. And you have to imagine the impact that has on a state to have almost 50% of a large student population not completing high school. And I always mention, of course, there's the outlier, the student that drops out and goes on to start a business and does, incredibly well. But as a whole, for, different, in terms of different economic impacts, non-completion of high school often means that people, don't contribute to the economy. They end up in situations like in prison or in on welfare or basically consuming social resources. Um, so it has a huge economic impact. And just to bring this into the contemporary time, Shelbyville, Indiana. This slide is from the cover of Time magazine. This is in the early 2000s. Time magazine did a whole expose on Shelbyville, Indiana. And what had happened was, for a period of time, I think schools had this kind of mentality of, if students are, don't want to be there or are not performing well, we should get rid of them so we can focus on the students who do want to learn. That is one of the positive outcomes, I think, since No Child Left Behind and since about the early 2000s, that schools have really begun to pay attention to completion rates and have changed their approach dramatically. And I will share with you a video called The Education of Omarina, which is a Frontline special that I think what's really powerful about it is that beyond the statistics, you get to see the individual story of a young woman who is faced with really significant challenges as a young woman, loses her father, mother is in an unstable situation, but her teachers rally around her, form a support network, and are able to get her through middle school into high school to successfully complete high school. And then what's interesting, I think, about the special, and one thing I would point out to you, is that I think Omarina is about a year or two maybe older than you guys, and she's maybe just graduated college, but has lived through basically the same time period. And she has a twin. She has a twin brother who did not receive those same supports in school. He went to a different school, and he ended up at the end of the special in prison. But I do want you to watch that, and there is an extra credit question on the next exam related to it. And what I specifically ask that you pay attention to is the Robert Belfans data, which Robert Belfans is a professor at Johns Hopkins University who does an analysis of large data sets around school completion rates. And he points out the three indicators that indicate that a student is struggling and at risk of dropping out. And I want you to be aware of those three core indicators from that piece. And I will try to point you to the time period where that comes. And I always like to expand and just say with school completion that Belfans does point out that it's important to build the habits in younger children in elementary school, and that K through fifth grade elementary school teachers should be aware of building those healthy attendance patterns. Middle school, he points out, is kind of the critical time, that key transition period that the teachers need to be aware of. And then high school is where districts need to have that element of shepherding to get students through to completion. And that's one of the credible things about the story with Omarina. Her homeroom teacher from middle school, they stay in touch by phone and by Zoom and things like that, video conference, like on a weekly basis, all the way through high school until Omarina graduates. And there's some different, if you want to check the PowerPoint, there's some different suggestions in there. All right, so curriculum differentiation. The key point to know here is that Hispanic students through the 20th century are underrepresented in high ability classrooms by more than double, by twofold. So they are Hispanic students underrepresented in high ability, AP gifted classes by twofold or double. I apologize. Underrepresented in high ability classrooms, overrepresented in low ability classrooms. So overrepresented by twofold in low ability classes, underrepresented in high ability classes. So sorry for any confusion there. 2 points I want you to remember from language exclusion. One key data statistic is that less than 7% of schools throughout the Southwest had a bilingual program for Hispanic students. So less than 7% through this time period had bilingual education available for students. The other term that I'd like you to be familiar with is what the author calls the sink or swim pedagogical practice of English only instruction. And I always resonate with this strongly. I took a language immersion class at one point, and the first semester, I remember the instructor completely refused to speak at all in English, and I sank in that class. I ended up dropping it. And I retook it the next semester and took it with a professor who I could meet with during office hours and who explained, I just remember explaining to me a couple key points throughout the course when I was struggling and I was able to get through. So again, the phrase here is sink or swim practice of English only, which was what most Hispanic students were subjected to. And then in terms of higher education, similar as last time, that we see major disparities between Anglo and Hispanic students throughout the 20th century. And unfortunately, though, again, there were some Hispanic students who did make it to college and who did become successful. The authors are clear to not paint a kind of overgeneralized portrait. Even against great odds, Hispanic students did, make it to college. But there was a major disparity. And I think the other disparity that's really stands out to me are the retention rates, the low retention rates for Hispanic students. So even if you have, 10 to 15% enrolling in higher education, only about 7% are making it through to a bachelor's degree. This is an area where I will just mention as a side note, we have made progress. We do see a very positive uptick with Hispanic and African American enrollment in higher education today. But the kind of caveat is we still have some of those challenges around completion and retention rates. And then there are also disparities with Hispanic and African American students over enrolled in, for example, 2-year institutions versus 4-year institutions, elite private institutions versus public institutions, those types of things. So disparities that still exist. All right, well, I think I have covered everything. And I am available if you have any questions.